Welcome back to Haunted and Historic Australia for another episode of Criminals, Cutthroats and Convicts and part 3 of Sydney's original gangster, Chow Hayes. We left off from part 2 just after Chow's nephew, Danny Simmons, was shot in their own home. The home shortly after was a hive of police and detectives, forensics, and naturally Chow and his family were asked many questions about why they believe Danny was shot. It wasn't long before Chow realised that the shots were meant for him. The night that Danny died, the family were taken to the police station and questioned. They weren't able to get back into the house till about 10 o'clock the next morning to get clothes and other possessions, as the police were definitely going to be holding on to their home for a couple of days and going through and searching for as much information they could, most likely on Chow as well, to try and bury him. But they were staying at Ninny's place until this all blew over. Chow, however, was back to work and naturally wanted to find out who knew what. And it wasn't long before all the details became quite clear as to how the night's events unfolded. While Chow's family was staying with Auntie Ninny, Chow was staying with one of his mates who had met in prison a couple of years back, Joey Hollowbone. The very next day after the murder, Chow was back at the 2-Up games, and they basically told him what had happened, because after Bobby Lee shot Danny Simmons, whom he thought was Chow, he went into smoke, which is also another word for going on the lam or just going into hiding, because he knew that there'd be retaliation for Chow's death. But he didn't realise that he'd shot, at that time, the wrong fella until later. And then there was no way he was going to come out of hiding too early. Chow knew Bobby Lee had gone into hiding now, but also knew he was too vain to stay hidden. He put out the word to his acquaintances that he was out for him. One of these acquaintances was a Jackie Hodder. He told Chow that his brother, Wally, was in contact with Bobby Lee about various things. Now Wally agrees to help set up Bobby Lee because he obviously doesn't want to get on Chow's bad side, as he fears Chow a lot more than Bobby Lee. Wally arranges to meet Bobby Lee at the Ziegfeld nightclub and cabaret. The club Ziegfeld was named after Florence Ziegfeld, who had a famous comedy cabaret act with dancing girls playing in an American Palm Beach supper club from the 1920s. It was famous all over the world, and obviously the owners decided to sample the name for their club in Sydney. The Ziegfeld Club was located at 88 King Street in Sydney. It had previously been known as the Ginger Jar Cafe, but that was changed after a few murders had taken place there. One of Chow's mates, Dick Riley, was the doorman there, and he knew him pretty well, and he knew he wouldn't get any grief from him. Dick Riley had actually shot a man outside the club many years back. The poor owner thought that changing the name from Ginger Jar Cafe to Ziegfeld Club would leave the dark past behind. Well, that was never going to happen. Not in Sydney. Now the setup was in full swing. Wally was to call Chow and let him know when Bobby Lee arrived. And Chow and his mate Joey Hollowbone were going to go to the club, lure Bobby outside and whack him. Well, it was a great plan, only it didn't go that way. Joey meets back at Chow's place before they go to the club, but Joey has brought his missus with him, Hazel, which in turn causes Topsy to want to come out to the club as well. And Topsy notices that Chow's taken his 45 from the hiding spot. Now she knows something's up, and it's possible that she didn't want anything to go down and thought that by going along nothing would happen or Chow wouldn't do anything. How wrong was she? In the end, he couldn't talk Topsy out of coming along, and time was running out. They'd just received a call from Wally that Bobby had arrived. It was go time. They organise themselves and the ladies, and they get on the way to the club. When they arrive at the club, they walk in. Chow immediately notices Lee, and Lee notices Chow. Lee must know by now Chow wants him dead, because Chow never goes to the club, definitely doesn't take Topsy. Lee thinks at this point that he's safe. Chow's got his wife there, and there's so many people inside the club. Chow couldn't start anything inside here. They sit the ladies down about 3 tables from Bobby and order some drinks. Once they were all settled at the table, Chow looks over at Lee, who's looking over at him. He was seated with Wally and Wally's wife Betty. There were 2 other women and another man. Now still at this point, Topsy doesn't know that Chow knows that Lee killed her nephew. Chow was trying to plan how this was all going to unfold. At that point, Lee gets up and goes to the dance floor with some of the women. Wally and Betty Hodder come over to Chow's table and say hello, at what time Betty asks Chow for a dance. This way at least Chow could check on Lee on the dance floor, still try and work out how he was going to knock him off. As Betty and Chow get to the dance floor, Lee and his partner return to their seats. After the dance finishes, they end up right next to Lee's table, where he's seated. So Chow says thank you to Betty and walks over to Lee's table and sits down in the empty chairs that Betty and Wally would have had. Lee says to Chow, "Are you going to let bygones be bygones and we'll have a drink?" And Chow says, "Have a drink? You bastard." Lee says it was just a mistake, and at this time Hollowbones come over to the table. Not wanting to cause a scene right there, Chow says to Hollowbones straight away, "We're letting bygones be bygones." He thought he'd go along with Lee for a little while until he got him outside. But then Joey Hollowbone sticks his nose in and says, "Well, it wasn't nice what you did to our mates," talking about the time when Lee attacked his mates who were just thieves, not actual fighters, which is pretty much what started the whole thing anyway in the last part. But Lee, instead of calming the situation down as he tried to with Chow, starts up again. "Oh, well, it wouldn't have mattered who it was," Lee was saying. "Even if it was you," and he points at Hollowbone, "even if it was Chow." And that was it. Chow got the shits. Chow says, "You're fucking joking." But he snapped right back and said, "No, Chow, I'm not joking." And then Chow says, "Look, I want to have a talk with you. Let's go outside." And Lee would not go outside. "I'm not going to go outside with you." And Chow said, "You'll have to leave sometime." But Lee was so cocky. He's got this guy sitting across from him, the most notorious gunman, Sydney's biggest gangster, and he's mouthing off because he thought he was safe in the club, so many people around. It may have also been because Bobby Lee had also been in a movie called Kangaroo, which was taped the year before in 1950, and he probably thought he was a little bit of a celebrity, and he's got all these people around him and Sheila's and safety. Also, he thinks. Chow tries again. "Come on, let's go outside." To which Lee says, "Are you effing silly? I'm not going outside. I'm staying in here with my friends." And Chow goes, "Why do you think I want you outside?" And Lee says, "To go on with it, of course," meaning that he'd kill him. And Chow says, "No, I told you, it's all forgotten." And Lee said he ain't going outside. And he says to Chow, "And you wouldn't do it in here with the lights on and all these people around." And just then, Chow pulled his gun out from his waistband, held it just above the table. "I'll fucking give it to you here, don't worry about that." And Lee said, "No you ain't, there's too many witnesses." Chow says, "Are you going to go outside?" And Lee says, "Go get effed." And Chow picks up the gun, aims it at Lee. "Well, here's yours." And he fires into his chest twice. He fell off the back of the chair and onto the floor. And Chow got up, walked around the table with all the screams and carrying on, people running, and he fired a couple more bullets into him. Now after the first couple of shots, Hollowbone runs back to the table where the women were, where their wives were, and grabs them, drags them, and starts running out of the club as fast as they can. Everybody is in a hysteria at the moment, running every which way, and a couple of people tried to stop Hollowbone and the women from getting out. Chow at this point is running kind of behind them to try and get out, and this idiot grabs him from nowhere. One of the bouncers grabs him and says, "That's the most cold-blooded killing I've ever seen." and to which Chow puts his gun into his ribs and says, "Do you want to have one too?" But they finally get out of there, even though he's going to be witnessed. If he can get rid of the gun, possibly it could be acquitted. Everyone's in a scrambling mess outside. Topsy is told by Chow to go and get the kids from the neighbours and meet him at Ninny's. She gets onto a tram and's out of there, and he gets into the car and heads to Sydney Harbour Bridge, where he knows he can throw this gun into the Sydney Harbour and it'll never be found. So he turns up at the bridge. It's late. There's not a lot of cars. He gets out to one of the pylons and he chucks that bastard out. However, unbeknownst to Chow, the gun doesn't go into the water, but it falls down into a little parkland below, which in turn is his undoing later on. Anyway, he works out that the cops know from the murder of his nephew that they stay at Ninny's. They know where Ninny lives. So he gets into a taxi straight away and goes to Ninny's. And just as he arrives there, tells Topsy, "Look, the cops know that they're here, so we got to go." He leaves the kids with Ninny, and then Topsy and Chow make off. They're going to have to go on the lam for a little while because the cops are going to be looking for them after all these witnesses. Well, it's pandemonium outside the Ziegfeld club. Betty Hodder is spoken to about Chow, and she says that she saw the gun and has basically incriminated him. So there you go. He's got one witness's testimony that's going to put him away. It's a hard state of affairs because really most of the women, the wives of these crooks, have no idea what's going on. Some of them do, probably Hazel did, but for the most part Topsy never knew or didn't really know the details of what was going on, and it's possibly that Betty was the same, so we can't really, throw her under the bus for being honest. She just told him what she saw. Dancing Betty. Topsy finally asks Chow what the shooting was about. While they were on their way to Izzy's place, that's Chow's cousin, Izzy Bollard, they were going to hide out there for a little while. Chow explains to Topsy why it was that he just shot Lee. It was over Danny, and probably hoped that she wouldn't hate him for it. The next morning, Chow was going to meet up with Joey Hollowbone at the Montesetti's fish shop, while Izzy Bollard, his cousin, was taking Topsy to get some solicitor help, to get a lawyer, Phil Roach. Topsy had been coached by Chow to say that, she saw a man dead, but, it wasn't Chow that shot him. That's all she knew. Hazel put up a fight and wouldn't make a statement, so she was locked up, telling them to go and get effed. Strangely enough, Bobby Lee survived the onslaught by Chow and lived another 12 hours. He ended up with 5 bullets in him. Strangely also, back at the club after Chow and the ladies and Hollowbone had all gotten out, the man running Ziegfeld's at the time, Eric O'Farrell, had thought that Wally was actually the guy that killed Lee. Eric O'Farrell had knocked Wally out, and when the police arrived he was still there, and they basically took Betty and Wally into the police station and charged Wally with the murder. This wasn't good because they didn't want Wally to go down for this. This was really bad, and they don't get bail on a murder charge, so... Now naturally, this is where it all comes undone, because Betty's seen Chow with a gun, and the cops would have said, "We're going to put your husband away for this," and Wally would have been done. So naturally, you can see why Betty would have squealed, because it would have been her husband going away for life, or getting the death penalty. Now when Topsy makes a statement to the police, they put her in jail. They know that this is going to bring Chow out, and after Betty's already implicated him, Chow's the one they're really after. Now it was a couple of days while the wives were in jail until they were able to go to court and be allowed to be bailed out. And the bail was set at $1,000. Joe Taylor had gone down and bailed them out, as normal, but it's also known that Kate Lee went down to bail Topsy out as well, but when she arrived, Topsy had already left. Now, Chow and Hollowbone were hiding out at Monasetti's first, and then they were able to find another guy, another mate of theirs, in the Rockdale-Cogra area, and decided to hide out there for about a week. They were there until their mate's missus started creating a bit of tension, and then decided Hollowbone would go back to Monasetti's fish shop and stick it out there, and Chow said he's just going to go home. He went back to Thomas Street because he figured that'd be the last place that the cops would look for him. Now, it's quite interesting that he's there for several weeks before he's found out. He was hiding out, and every time the police would come to the door and knock on the door, Topsy would answer the door and offer him a cup of tea, knowing that they wouldn't have time to come and sit down. It wouldn't be worth it to them because Chow wasn't there, but he was there, and it was laughable. While Chow was at home, he was bored, so he starts gambling and gets Topsy to put bets on for him. And it was about 6 weeks after the shooting that he decided this has to stop, as someone's going to know that he's at home and Topsy's running the bets back and forth. So he keeps quiet. Around this time, Hollowbone is found under a bed at the Monasetti fish shop, and obviously Monasetti is heavily interrogated and eventually gives Chow up. There was even a policewoman that was following Chow's daughter to school and back, just on the off chance that she might run into Chow. And Chow was at home the whole time. It couldn't have really come too soon, because one of the papers on the 24th of June had stated that there was going to be a shootout, that Chow was ready to shoot it out with police if they tried to take him. So it was pretty fitting that they'd come to Chow's house. Now, Chow knew this. He knew about the newspaper. So when he knew that they were coming, he sat at his table, put his hands on the table and waited for them to come and arrest him. Before Chow was taken in, he'd basically told Topsy and his kids that he was going to go away, and hugged them all. Chow wasn't going to put up a fight because he didn't know how much of the story the police had actually believed, if he was going to shoot it out with them, that is. And he didn't want that, not at his house. So he went with them amicably. However, when he gets out to the front of his house, a journalist is there to take the photos, to which Chow spits at him and tells him to get effed. On the trip to the police station, the police advised him that they'd found the 45. A man had been walking his greyhound the following morning after the shooting, and had come across it and taken it straight to police. When they got to the police station, more reporters were out there taking photos of Chow as he was taken inside. Now, Topsy was going to be charged for harbouring a fugitive, and the police knew that she knew that he was there. I mean, she was there when he was caught, so they were going to be charging her and Hazel and Hollowbone, as well as Chow. And on September the 11th, they all got bail except for Chow. They knew he did it alone, and he was going to be going to jail for it. Or he was going to be on trial for the murder. They had many people come and pick out Chow from the lineup, but nobody would identify him of those people who were in the club that night, whether it was because they didn't see anything or because they were scared for their lives. Nobody would point Chow as the murderer. It was only Betty. The coroner had ruled out of anybody else being involved. It was just a lone gunman, 5 bullets from the one gun. Betty was the only one that police could hold as the witness. Nobody else was willing to testify against Chow. So the case rested solely on the one witness. Now, Sergeant Kelly, who was basically leading the assault against Chow, tried everything he could to get the desired result, a death penalty for Chow. He'd been after Chow for years, especially after the Wayman murder, and he wanted to pin this on him badly. Chow was put on 3 separate trials for the murder of Bobby Lee. In the 2 first trials, the juries couldn't get a decision, and Betty Hodder kept fainting when she was brought to the stand. In the end, Kelly himself, Sergeant Kelly, went to the stand and spoke to the jury. Well, whatever he said, it must have been strong enough because the jury bought it, and Hayes was found guilty on this third trial. Kelly must have done a really good job. He wanted Chow Hayes put away so badly, and was able somehow to sway the jury to believe that Hayes was the man. They would have brought all the information about the Wayman case, about Danny Simmons, and the retaliation killing of Bobby. And for Sergeant Ray Kelly, it worked. Chow was guilty. These trials had been going on for a year, and the death penalty was finally handed down a day before the anniversary of Bobby Lee's death. As the sentence was being handed down, Chow was spitting venom at Sergeant Kelly, even saying, "I hope I live to see you die of cancer of the tongue," for putting Chow into this position. Now, Chow states that Labor was in office at this stage, and this would have prevented him from actually being given the death penalty. He later states that if Liberals had been in power, that he would have been put to death by hanging. Chow was commuted to life in prison and believed he'd never get out again. He spent originally a couple of years in Long Bay and was transferred to Bathurst Jail and then on to Maitland Jail. He hadn't been to Maitland Jail before. Now, in those days, being sentenced to life in jail meant that you had around 20 years. People had even been let out earlier. Chow was quite happy with sentence being commuted to life imprisonment. Normally, life imprisonment meant around 20 years jail time, and he knew that once that 20 years was up, he had still some time to live a bit of life before he died. Get to see his kids have a bit of a life. At Bathurst Jail, he was doing his time and was doing a bit of working. Now, they were allowed to have certain tools when they worked in certain areas of the jail. And as it would have it, there was a man who was working in the same area as Chow and ended up going mad one day and attacking a screw, or one of the wardens, with a knife. And the knife actually belonged to Chow, or his workstation. And Chow was dragged back to Long Bay and in front of a judge over whether or not he'd handed this knife to the fella that ended up stabbing the screw. Well, anyway, turns out they decided they were going to send him from Bathurst now onto Maitland, and this was where he would see out the last 13 years of his sentence. Maitland was also where some of the worst murderers and criminals were kept. Time inside the jail wasn't eventful for Chow, other than just mingling with other criminals and murderers, finding out stories about different people and meeting new people as time went on. He states later on in his book with David Hickey that it was hardest on Topsy and the kids. People on the outside waiting for you to come out are the ones that are often ridiculed and teased. It must have been hard on Chow's family while he was in there. But for Chow, the time went quite fast, although he did hear of Hollerbone's death while he was inside. Hollebone had continued to racket around Sydney without his mate, got mixed up with Lenny McPherson and his crowd, but eventually Hollebone died from a brain hemorrhage. After Chow had served 12 years in jail, he started to develop stomach cramps, which he dismissed first as being just an upset or tummy bug in the dodgy prison system. But they got worse and worse, and he ended up having to be put into hospital. While he was in hospital, the Comptroller General of Prisons, John Moroney, who Hayes had known back in Sydney, decided to come and see Chow at the Maitland Hospital. He also organised for Topsy to come from Sydney and visit him at Maitland Hospital and be there whenever she wanted to. Lucky for Chow, he had friends in high places. At the hospital, John Moroney asked Chow to promise him he wouldn't try to escape jail if he made things a little easier for him while he was there. He didn't have that much time left on his sentence, so he wasn't going to try anything now. And as a result, he was treated like a normal patient at the hospital, and Topsy came to visit. Topsy had been pretty well looked after. Joe Taylor was giving Topsy Chow's regular wage, even though he wasn't there to do it, as well as Kate Lee helping out the family still when she could, until a time where she didn't really have the money to do it anymore. And Dick Riley, his old mate before he died, was giving a hand to the family, as well as Per Scalia. Chow's mates on the outside did everything they could to help the family while Chow was on the inside, something he'd remember forever. As for poor Dick Riley, he got involved with some not so nice people in the 1960s. He was doing quite well for himself, but was ambushed outside his home just as he was getting in the car, and his car actually rolls down the street and into the side of a wall. A short time later, John Moroney visited Chow after his hospital stint had ended and was back in Maitland Jail. He said to Chow that he was going to try and get him transferred to a prison camp, which was kind of like a halfway between hardened criminal prison and being released to the wild, so to speak. He was going to be moved to the prison camp at Bathurst Jail, or Kirkconnell, and then it was not long till he was released home. While Chow was at Kirkconnell, he became the SP bookmaker there and basically ran things. He enjoyed it. It gave him a taste of what he could expect leaving jail. Even though Chow was no longer the feared gunman he was back 12 years ago, he'd been replaced by other heavies such as Lenny McPherson. But before Chow leaves Kirkconnell, he is actually found to have kidney cancer. After being in extreme pain, he's transferred to Sydney right away to the Prince Henry Hospital and had a kidney removed. After Chow recovered from the kidney surgery, he actually enjoyed staying at Prince Henry Hospital, and he gave the nurses and doctors a hand where he could, which is really out of character, kind of, for Chow. He was helping them clean windows and help others with their catheters and things like that. And his doctor, actually, when the time came for him to go back to Long Bay Jail, as going back to Bathurst was out of the question due to his situation, he gave him eggs and milk as part of his diet when he went back to Long Bay Jail. Well, the superintendent abolished that and threw him back in a cell instead of keeping him at the prison hospital. And when Topsy arrived and found out about this, she went and spoke to his doctor at Prince Henry Hospital, and in turn, the message got through to John Moroney. Well, John Moroney had the superintendent investigated, and shit really hit the fan for him. At the hearing, John Moroney spoke on Hayes' behalf, stating that he'd been a model prisoner the whole entire time he'd been behind bars. The crime had been committed as a retaliation to his nephew being shot. No other bystanders were harmed or anything like that at the time. The judge turned to Hayes and handed him a piece of paper and said to read what was on the paper. Chow looked down at the paper and noticed that there was nothing on it. He said, "It's blank." And the judge said to Chow, "Yes, it's a blank sheet. Now what are you going to do with it?" The 2 years after Chow's released from jail, he loses Topsy. She dies in 1969. Poor Topsy had been through so much with Chow, running backwards and forwards between jails to see him and in hospital, that over time she began to get sick herself. Dolly, who was Danny Simmons' sister and obviously Chow's favourite, while Topsy was sick, Dolly and little Topsy was helping Chow look after her in her final years. After Topsy died, Chow moves in with Dolly, as Dolly had been primarily caring for Big Topsy, or Topsy, while she was sick. I'm not sure where little Topsy is at the moment. She's probably married and had kids, but he decides to move in with Dolly. Now, to make some money, Chow was a bit older now and wasn't the feared standover man that he was, but people still feared him. He worked for a man named Donnie Smith and his wife Linda, who owned a couple of brothels. They put him on the payroll and suggested that another man, Joe Borg, who had several places who was also in the same business, to go and bite him for $1,000. And Chow thought, all right, He meets up with a mate of his, Charles Chicker Williams, who knows a bit about Joe Borg and is quite close to him on his payroll. And he says, look, things have changed since you've been in jail. Other people have come up now, and this Joe Borg, well, he's got cops on the payroll. That's why he's so successful. Just something that day that hadn't been really done before. People, the likes of Kate Lee and Tilly Devine, had to fight the police tooth and nail for everything on every occasion. But now it was starting to get to a time where the police were quite corrupted, and Joe Borg was just one of those guys that had enough money to go around for everybody, and he was allowed to have as many prostitution places as he wanted and do other racketeering and things like that because he was paying off the cops. But Charles Chicker Williams warned Chow that not to get on his bad side because the cops could put him back in jail if Joe Borg wanted them to. So he tried his luck anyway, and after asking Joe Borg for $1,000, Joe Borg didn't want him coming around hitting him up for $1,000 all the time, so he decided he'd put Chow on the payroll at $100 a week. And that suited Chow quite fine, because he was also on the payroll for Donnie Smith and Linda, who had the other places. So he was doing pretty well at this point. Well, this only lasted for a time because someone ended up blowing Joe Borg up. And it's a strange state of affairs, because when this all went down, Lenny McPherson stated to police, as he was an informant at the time, that Chow Hayes had blown Joe Borg up. Police actually came and took Chow to the police station and questioned him over the death of Joe Borg, stating that he'd killed him because he wouldn't pay him standover money or something to that effect. Chow was able to talk his way out of it, stating that he'd only just gotten out of jail and was trying to keep his nose clean. Thankfully, the police believed him and let him go. Now, Chow wanted to just live out the rest of his life what little he thought he had left because of his kidney cancer. And he and another mate, Jackie Ratty Clark, decided that they'd go and drink at the Prince Alfred Club, which was opposite the Prince Alfred Hospital. Now, Chow and Clark got into a routine of drinking there with a couple of other mates. One included Gerald Hutchinson, who was a petty criminal. They had a couple of trays and bowls on the table, which they would put some loose change and money on, a couple of 20s or 50s at the time, just so they could consistently keep buying drinks for the night. Well, one night, as the story goes, Chow's at the bar ordering a couple of drinks, and he notices Jerry with his hand in the money bowl. He doesn't think much of it at the time, but later on, when Jerry asks to take some money out of the jar to buy a round of drinks, Chow questions him, well, you've got enough in your pocket, don't you? And Jackie knocks his pocket and it jingles with money, and they call him out for being a bit of a cheat. Chow again doesn't think much of it, it's only loose change anyway, and he's got enough in his pocket, so he doesn't think much of the matter and dismisses it. But however, Jerry doesn't let it go and consistently jabs at Chow for making a deal of it earlier throughout the whole night, until he starts wanting to take Chow outside and have a fist fight over it, which is really strange for anyone who actually knows Chow. You don't start fights with Chow. Anyway, to make matters worse, there's a couple of birds that they wanted to hit on at the time and miss out an opportunity to do this. So Chow's in a bit of a mood now, and the next time Jerry jeers at him, he smashes a bottle and puts it into Jerry's face. This requires him to get stitches and gouges one of his eyes out. Chow still has it. Well, what a mess. Eventually the police come and interrogate everybody. Nobody says very much, but in the end, Jerry gives him up and he's taken back to jail. He just got out not long ago. Chow's put away for 5 years. It was lucky as the judge wanted to put him away for more. The jury may have felt bad for him as he was an older guy. Luckily, Dolly sticks with him. He no longer has Topsy to come and visit him. He's put into Parramatta Jail, which luckily isn't that far away from where Dolly is in Campsie. Now, Chow being at Parramatta, is able to get a position after a few years due to his good behaviour, being able to look after the weekend detention prisoners. This is all going well and they're pretty happy with him at the prison until a newspaper reporter comes to the jail to look into this weekend detention centre that was fairly new and finds out that Chow is the one looking after the locking up and general maintenance in the place, and puts it on the newspaper front the next day. Well, this causes grief for Chow because now the position's taken away from him. The Parramatta Jail doesn't want the publicity of the most notorious gunman in Sydney being able to work outside the prison. So the job's no longer Chow's. But as the superintendent is very proud of the way that Chow's been throughout his prison term so far, he decides that he's going to do him a favour and try and get him transferred to a minimum security prison, being that of Emu Plains. At first, Chow's not very impressed about it because it's far for Dolly to travel to go and see him, so he ums and ahs about it. In the interim, he actually gets Dolly to put a couple of lottery bets on for him for his birthday, and they come out with a $40,000 win. He's on a high, and he gives the money mainly to Dolly and his kids. It's around 1973 now, and his kids are well grown up. Paddy had a bit of a shaky start, being put in jail himself, but he seems to be going on the straight and narrow now. Anyway, Chow decides to go to Emu Plains for a time until he finds out that there's an opening at Malabar Detention Centre, which is at Long Bay, and it's got a day leave scheme, whereas if he's on his best behaviour, he can get out for the day and spend some time with his family. So he goes for that and ends up over at Malabar Detention Centre. Being allowed to spend time with his family whilst in prison made the time go really fast, and he was out in no time. So he rang Dolly and told her to come and pick him up. He was finally released again. He'd done his time. He went and bid Per Scalia for $2,000 to help him establishing himself again, and the newspapers reported John Frederick Chow Hayes, convicted murderer, standover man, was released after serving 22 years in jail. In his new freedom, he moved into John Street, Lidcombe. Now, Chow has surpassed, at this stage, his 2 years to live, and he outlived his own son, Paddy, who died in 1987. Joe Taylor had organised for a plot when Topsy died that Chow would go in when he died, but instead Paddy died, so Chow decided that he would stay in with his mum, the plot that was meant for him, and he stated that when he died he would be cremated and could have his ashes placed over the top of the both of them. And that's what happened. Chow lived out his days in Lidcombe. On the 5th of September 1990 he turned 79. He'd had many transfusions at this stage because he was still sick, but he was outliving many of the crooks and gangsters of his time. Chow had now reached an age where everything had changed. Everything from when he was a young boy and all the trouble he'd been into, as well as the time spent in jail, the 22 years. Everything had changed around him by 1990. Buildings had gone up, and even the streets where he used to live had all been replaced with new buildings and housing. He may have been Sydney's first gangster, a notorious gunman, but he wasn't as bad as many of the other criminals, rapists and murderers. He was a tough guy, brought up in a tough world, and, as David Hickey states in his book, even at the end, was making sure that he wasn't getting crossed. David Hickey even states that after the book went on sale that Chow threatened him that if he was putting one over him, he'd meet his maker. He was a tough guy, and he goes down in history as one of the toughest. And when you look at the 3 parts we've made, you'll see that there's something about Chow Hayes that he isn't such a bad guy. Although he did a lot of bad things to other bad or shady characters, he was a pretty good bloke, as well as many of the other underworld figures who we've seen on the screens as being these nasty sorts. But even Kate Lee, who we'll be doing very shortly, had a soft side. Well, we hope you enjoyed this 3-part special on Chow Hayes. We thoroughly enjoyed his story, and we've got so many more people's stories to tell, including Miss Kate Lee, which, if you hang around, should be up really soon. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any more of our episodes on Darlinghurst's crooks, the Razor Gang, and many other underworld figures.
When I fired the gun, I made sure that I hit him. Well, I made sure that I tried to kill him because you didn't know whether they was going to back up or not. 99 times out of 100 they would.